Let's take a look at a diagram here of network address translation. If we look at this little diagram here, we can see a router or a firewall doing network address translation. And the idea is that you have on the internet public IP addresses, and I just made up a fictitious address here, 66.132.47.15. Remember how we saw an example. IP addresses are 4 numbers. We call those numbers octets. And there's a reason for it. It's because in binary there are 8 binary digits there. But we have public addresses here on the internet. And then hiding behind our firewalls or routers, we have private IP addresses. And the firewall or the router usually does network address translation right on the edge there between private and public. Now, I have to tell you that there are thousands of routers in the internet. They don't do network address translation. They simply relay the traffic along in the correct direction. Remember how I said that a router is basically a big freeway interchange with a traffic cop sitting over it saying, okay, you coming in here, go that way, you go that way, you go that way. But on the edge of your company network or even your home network, you probably are doing network address translation. Now, there's a thought about this, and especially from security. The problem with just using straight public addresses, I mean, why don't we just simply use public addresses? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One, we're running out, and we've been running out. And that's why we have this whole concept of reserved private addresses. And then what you have is you can use these private addresses freely, but you get translated to maybe just one public address, and everybody shares that public address, and they have their individual sessions distinguished because they all use a different port. That's getting a little bit beyond the scope of a CISA class, but it's good to have the background. And I had promised you that you would know all of the networking background and all the technical background that you need to know for the CISA exam. So we have public addresses here. Most organizations use private addresses and then use network address translation. However, I do have to tell you, I have been on some sites where they didn't. I was actually one time at a major motion picture studio in Los Angeles, and they had public addresses. They had a Class B block all to themselves, and I was warned that at my desktop, my laptop, I would get a public address, and they said, hope you have your personal firewall on. The risk of using a public address and being just right outside your firewall on the internet is that if you don't have some protection on your computer, within 10 minutes it will catch something off the internet. It'll get hacked, it'll catch some kind of virus, something. Because that kind of activity is going by constantly, just automated broadcasts, or not broadcasts, but automated transmissions, automated tools, just trying to catch any unwary machine out there. If you look down here, you'll see that there are certain address ranges that have been reserved specifically for private addresses. One is any address that starts with 10, and it can be 10.something.something.something. That's why I put in 10xyz. So you saw that mine was what, 10.1.something, right? It could also be 172.16.something.something all the way through 172.31.something.something. Could be anything in that range. Or it could be 192.168.something.something. And in smaller organizations and also in home networks, almost certainly your private IP addressing scheme is 192.168.something.something. In medium-sized networks or larger ones, maybe the departments will have 192.168, but that they tend to go towards the 10 or the 172.16. It is totally up to your network administrator and your network designers to choose which you're going to use. There's no desirability of one over the other, except maybe the 10s have more possible addresses. And there are plenty of devices that by default use some address range, typically 192.168. Totally up to, like I said, your network engineers to choose and design. But when your traffic leaves your private network, it's got to be translated to something public. So there might be like 100 of us in the private network here in the LAN, the local area network, and we're all sharing a public address. And each of us has a different little port number, which is basically a little number that defines the application. And so we're all sharing this. Out on the internet, it looks like there are a whole bunch of connections from this public address here. Nobody knows that it's actually being translated here to something hidden and private. So in that way, using private addresses in network address translation, because it helps hide you and because there's no actual route on the internet to any private address, it's disallowed, it helps give you security through obscurity, really is what it is. Also, if your router or your firewall doesn't have any translation at the moment, then there's no way to make a connection into these individual privately addressed machines because there's no entry in the table to route it. So there's a little bit of security there. There are ways to get around it, but that's far less likely to happen. You'll notice I've got another number down here, 169.254. While this is not a classic private address that we use, it is a reserved address just in case a computer can't get an address. You know, when a computer or device boots up, one of the first things it does is it says, hey, I don't have an address. Can somebody please give me an address? And there will be a server off to the side called a DHCP server that says, yeah, here you go. And it's all done by broadcast. But sometimes that DHCP server, which is often a service running on the router in a small network, sometimes that service either ran out of addresses or isn't running or isn't responding somehow. When that happens, a computer will self-assign an address, a 169.254 something something. If you see that, you know that the computer tried to get an address and couldn't, so it's self-assigned. It's more of a diagnostic, and it does allow the computer to get on the network, but nobody uses it as a practical means of addressing. So these are the addresses that are considered private, that are used internally, that must be translated by a network address translation device, such as a firewall or a router. Next thing we're going to talk about is virtual private networks.